have prepared a very interesting and very challenging kind of concept note, which was provided to me, and I read it with great interest, and in which you have already mentioned that the cooperatives has a position in the Constitution, but that is restricted to the directive principles of state policy. In fact, it has always interested me that some of the most acceptable slogans or issues that is discussed in the Constitution by almost everybody, particularly people who are involved in social activism, are put in the directive principles. I don't know how it happened. You look at decentralization, you look at cooperatives. There have been, if I may use a word, with all respect to the fathers of the Indian national movement, I am not mentioning mothers, though they should also be mentioned. But this act should be attributed only to the fathers, that these issues are not that serious. I mean, I don't know whether they were shelving it, because it is all, you find them in the directive principles alone. Not only that, the directive principles says that it is the duty of the states, it's the state's responsibility to advance, again, highly restricted to cottage industries, not to any other, which again indicates a certain preference which was prevailing at that time. Now, your own conceptual note laments the fact that in spite of the national policy on cooperatives expressed through the Multi-State Cooperative Societies Act in 2002 and other such legislative and non-legislative activities, cooperatives have not yet reached a level of development or progress that was expected of it. That, of course, almost everybody agrees with that. And with the onset of liberalization, there is a growing informalization of the world of work, and also a deterioration of the condition of the unorganized labor or informal labor. So these are all issues which people working in this area should be facing almost every day. Now, in addition to all this, we have this calamity of the pandemic of COVID, which is vitiating the situation. So we are not talking about happy times, we are talking about unhappy or bad times. Now, one way of escaping from the problems of today is to go into the past, go into the history, and say that in the past we were doing well, this was happening, but that may be a way of dodging the issue. I think if we go back into history, it should help us in reshaping our present and also resetting our goals, fresh goals for the future. So my attempt, I don't claim that I would completely succeed in that. My attempt would be to do exactly that, using Kerala as a case, because that's the only case I know. Almost every one among you must have heard this statement that, especially from people from Kerala, claiming that Kerala is different. Kerala is very different from other states of India. Yes, Kerala may be different, Kerala also sometimes could be found to be conforming to the national story altogether too. But there must be something which makes the people in Kerala claim that they are different, or their development experiences is a unique one and all that. In fact, there are scholars, I am also guilty of that, scholars who claim that there was a Kerala model of development. Though it has been contested very strongly by others who claim, who says that first of all, the way in which people are looking at the development of Kerala, which says that Kerala is different, is not the way in which it should be looked at. Secondly, there are other ways of similar development, but of course not using the same method. You can create wealth and distribute it. That can also be done. And they can cite examples from other parts of India too. Third would be, this is a kind of a state-managed kind of development. And unless the state is there to support the development pattern, the whole thing will collapse. So there are people who argue like that, and they have got very solid arguments behind their argument. So I'm not saying that their arguments should be neglected. I'll try to explain it in using my own terms and my own concepts. Now, the Kerala's particular kind of development has been worked on and brought to the attention of the public at large by two great economists of Indian origin itself. One is, of course, Professor K. Raj, who was the one who did the original study on the pattern of development that Kerala had. But he never used the word Kerala model of development. That should be marked. He never thought that there was a Kerala model of development. But then his colleague, they were together in the Delhi School of Economics, the Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, he got fascinated by this pattern of development and gave it a great exposure at the international level. So I'll try to reword, some of their own findings and findings of people like me who've been working in this area. Their studies, particularly that of Raj, found that all over the world there were normally two models of development. One is a developing country gets 4 in 8, massive size, and use that because the developing countries or ex-colonies, most of them were formerly colonies, they lack capital. They have always had enough labor. Only thing is that if the labor is to be utilized and create new wealth, you require capital too. So the capital should be lent by countries which have already accumulated that. So they claim that international cooperation for development should be there. So that is one way for that to work, your purpose in your development activities should be first to generate wealth. You use the capital flowing from outside to generate wealth. And then, when that wealth is sufficient, you can use it to be distributed among the people. Of course, they talked about, percolation theory. In drips it will come to the poorest people too. See, another argument, mainly by countries following a socialist path of development, they said that receiving money from outside will solve only some of your problems, but the whole system is unjust. It is not a normal justice-oriented system. So the system will have to be reformulated, will have to be reconstructed. Of course, their suggestion is that there should be a kind of uprising or a social revolution so that the society will become conducive for distribution to everybody. Now, these two models were very strongly held up by different people. But then, when Professor K. Raj and his colleagues started working on Kerala, they found that this region never received high foreign aid from any other country. Neither has the state had a social uprising or a revolution. It is an ordinary state like any other. Of course, they had radical parties and all that, but that's all. So, still this state seems to be having had development of a particular sort, that which we'll define later. These studies were made in 1970s, early 70s. That means 50 years ago. When they did those studies, Kerala was considered to be one of the poorest states in India in terms of per capita income, the income divided by the number of persons. Kerala was one of the poorest. So it is very surprising that even with that kind of very nominal income, Kerala was able to have the highest literacy rate in India, and also availability of health facilities, even to the comparatively poorer people, also available. And several other indicators, they found several other indicators. Now, it has all been worked into Human Development Index, HDI. That is, the creation of that has been done from this kind of work done on Kerala. How did this happen? What they found was, whenever there was a little development, little progress, immediately that extra income or extra development benefits is distributed among the people. I'm not saying that everybody got the share, but at least most of the people used to get the the benefits of distribution. As a result, in the 1970s itself, Kerala had more hospital and dispensary beds per 1,000 population than the rest of the country, much higher. It had the lowest infant mortality rate. It had all kinds of indicators. Then again, if you normally in the other states, how do you find, when you look at development goals, development targets, you normally say that the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are sidelined. They are not getting it. In Kerala also there is a difference between the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and the non-scheduled. But nevertheless, the margin between the difference between the two is the least, is the lowest compared to the rest of India. And thirdly, you look at these benefits, schools, dispensary beds and all that, in the urban areas and rural areas. Normally in other parts of India, it is the urban areas which will have more. But in Kerala, it is found that it is the rural areas which has got more schools, more hospital beds and all that. So that there is a distribution has been affected right along. All this requires some specific explanation because Kerala is like any other state in the country, under the same constitution, same type of people and all that. Now, the explanation, I would say, is largely with history, because what happened in the past. If you go back to the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, that is 1850 roughly, from 1850 onwards, you find that Kerala's agrarian economy, agriculture economy, Kerala didn't have at that time any industries to speak of. Mainly agriculture was the main occupation of the people. Agriculture economy undergoes a transformation, and the transformation I would call it as commercialization, because from 1850s onwards, agriculture in Kerala was not for consumption, not for eating alone. Normally we cultivate crops so that, our people and all get their food, and also extra, if there's something extra, we will send it to people who are in necessity. But from 1850 onwards, we find that more people in Kerala and more land in Kerala were engaged in cultivating crops for the market. They take it to the market and sell it and get money instead. What you find is that around that time, the Britishers who were ruling the country, they were interested in crops called plantation crops, tea, coffee, cinnamon, all pepper, and also later on rubber. So these crops were cultivated in big estates, plantation kind of estates. And all over India, the Britishers started such plantations only in directly British ruled regions. We had a British India and also an India ruled by Indian Maharajas. So they never did it in Maharajas. But in Kerala had two regions ruled by princes. One was Kochi and the other was Thiruvidankar or Travancore. But in these two regions, as an exception, in the whole of the country, only exception are these two. So these two states were chosen for British investment, British plantation investment. And there is yet another exception, that is Mysore. Mysore was also a princely state, but it had large number of plantations. But you should also remember that when they started plantations in Mysore, it was not under the Maharaja. Because after the Tipu's period, the whole region's rule has been taken over by the British under something called the Court of Wards. It is a rule which the colonial government imposed. And they took over the administration. It is when they were ruling Mysore that they started plantations in Mysore. I'm only saying this to clarify, to tell you that Mysore cannot be counted. In the rest of the country, they never allowed Indian Maharajas and their regions to have this kind of plantation development. You can have plantation crops, which is a sure way of commercializing your economy, because plantation crops you can't eat, you can't drink the rubber milk, rubber they call it milk, but you can't use it for drinking. You cannot live by eating tea or coffee. So these things are meant for the market, definitely. But that is called plantation crops or commercial crops. You also have, the word has already been used, cash crops. Cash crops meaning you always had pepper, you had cinnamon, you had all kinds of spices growing all over Kerala and also in hilly regions in other parts of the country. So those kinds of things also are meant for the market, because you can't use pepper for your daily food. But pepper is very, very necessary, because all over the world, everybody wants pepper. Okay? So Kerala had another advantage. What was that advantage? It was the region, the only region, you should remember all this. Do not think that I am boasting for Kerala. You can check on your history books. You'll find that the only region in the whole world where pepper was grown for commercial purposes. There was only another country was Zanzibar, a small island which later on became part of Tanzania. But they never knew the commercial value, so they never sold it in the market. Now, another point was that if you have a map of the world, at that time, nobody knew about the Americas. South America and North America was not known. So all over the world, the navigational routes were restricted to the tip of Africa, Europe, Asia, of course the Far East and all that. So in that kind of a map, if you have two ships moving by the sea breeze alone, because they don't have any motorized boats at that time. So two ships moving by sea breeze. One starting from Basra or somewhere near the Middle East in the West Asian region. Another boat leaving the South China Seas. These are the ends of the world. Yeah? These ships will inevitably meet in Kerala. You see, you have a map of the world, you will find it. In fact, if you miss Kerala, you will end up in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka and Kerala had this advantage of being the shop owners for the whole world. The people from the West will come in search of things produced in the East. When they come, the Kerala people would sit in there, they'll be, they won't do any work. They just, I'm exaggerating, but people will sit back and they'll sell whatever they got from the East to the people from the West. And whoever comes from the West, people from the East would be wanting things made in the West. So they buy things from the Western people and sell it to the Eastern people and make money either way. Therefore, in the whole of India, those of you who have done history in your higher classes would remember that we had 5 major trading regions. One was, of course, Gujarat, the other was Konkan, the third was Malabar, fourth was Coromandel, and the fifth was Bengal. So these are the 5 regions. And all the 4 regions except Malabar, that is Kerala, Kerala. The other 4 regions had some manufacturing also. That is why they used mainly, it was clothes that they were making, expensive Dhaka muslin and other things. Gujarat had its own very rich material. So that was helping their trade. Malabar didn't have any manufacturing. Not only then, even now. Even now, Kerala's contribution to India's exports is less than 4% manufactured products. But we have got so many other things which we can sell. We can sell our pepper, we can sell our fish, we can sell all other kinds of things. We can also sell our people, because our people are educated, they can go and work anywhere in the world. So, Kerala is a happy place to be. I hope that you understand the way in which I am building up. Now, since this is the situation, Kerala, later on diversions happened and people started growing these things in other parts of the world also. But until then, Kerala had this advantage. Now, this advantage was there even when the whole of India was colonized by the British and plantation economy developed and all that. So there was 2 types of commercialization. One is the extensive, that is big areas of commercial crops. we call it extensive commercialization through plantations. But at the same time, you also had an intensive commercialization. Intensive meaning you grow in small plots, but nevertheless, very crops which are in great demand in all over the world. Which are the crops which made Kerala come up with the economic ladder? One was, of course, natural rubber. Rubber was, of course, brought by the British, and they started it in plantation. But soon, ordinary farmers of Kerala found out they can also grow rubber. It doesn't require a kind of a big estate with its management and all that. They can grow it in even, now they are growing it in less than 1 acre. They used to grow it in less than 10 acres or even less than 5 acres. Then there was coconut. Coconut was there quite a long time in Kerala, but the intense cultivation of coconut, now everywhere you turn you find coconut trees. That kind of spread happened as a result of the growth of commercialization. And the farmers could shift from their earlier crops. Earlier they were growing whatever is required for a household, and also for medical purposes. Where some crops are grown purely for medical requirements. From that, they can shift over to the commercial crops, and commercial crops are of a longer duration because rubber, in those days, it required 12 years for it to yield, and coconut also required 8 to 10 years. So there is a big gap in between when you plant and when you get the yield. How do you live during that time? For that also, Kerala found a solution. That solution also came through the British. The British brought it from Amazon region called tapioca. And tapioca, now if you talk to a young boy or girl in Kerala, they wouldn't agree that. They would say that tapioca was here throughout, from the beginning of history. No. Tapioca came in the 19th century and it became a big crop in Kerala. And that is a short-term crop which can be a cheap substitute for rice, because people in Kerala are rice eaters. I'm sure by now those non-rice eaters must be fed up with eating rice day and night here in Kerala. We are rice eaters. So rice eaters, if they get a substitute for rice, a cheap substitute like tapioca, they would accept it. That is how Kerala's economy turned completely to a commercial economy. Now we come to the more contextual kind of points, that with this transformation, who gained? If you look at it, Kerala economy, Kerala society always had a hierarchy, a caste system, higher caste at the very top, middle caste at the slightly lower level, and the so-called lower caste at the bottom. And the lower caste were at one time treated as slaves, and there was slavery in Kerala, not only aggressive slavery, but also even parts of chattel slavery. So slavery was, and their labor was used for building all this kind of thing. Now, in this kind of a hierarchy, most of the land for cultivation and all that were owned by the highest caste, some of the royal people and rich people around. So they were owning. But they were not interested in acquiring new land, developing it and all that. They're already rich, they're already comfortable. So when the government required, the Government meaning the Maharajas required. When they were colonized and they had to pay a tribute, in addition to their own expenditure, they had to pay a tribute to the rulers at Delhi or Calcutta, wherever they were. Where do they find that money? And by the time they had themselves learned learn from the British how to dress and how to go about, they started buying Rolls Royce cars and all that. So they required money. So where do they get it? By extending your cultivation into your forest land as well as the shallow marshy areas. We have got large number of lagoons. We call it kyle, lagoons. So the shallow border areas of these lagoons could also be cultivated. But who will go and cultivate it? Not the rich, not the people who have got land already. It will be done by the people who are at the middle level, who were always wanting to catch up with the highest people. Now, government came out with a lot of proclamations, after proclamations, encouraging people to go and develop these areas and cultivate it. And the middle groups or middle communities and castes took it up. Now, Kerala's caste community structure is also slightly different from the rest of India, in the sense that among the Christians, a group called they're called Syrian Christians, not because they came from Syria, but they use the language Syriac for their worship. So Syrian Christians, Muslims, and Iyavas. Iyavas is a lower middle caste group. So these groups already had some rights over land, and they were accepted to some extent by the caste hierarchy, particularly the Christians, because Christians were required, because the higher caste, the Brahmins and people who run the temples and all that, they cannot receive anything from the poorest, from the so-called lowest caste, because that will create pollution. So they require somebody in between to buy it and give it to them. So the in-between role was assigned to the Christians, and they made it into a rule, saying that if it is polluted, you give it to a Christian. If he touches it, it will be all right. So that way the Christians was made use of, and Christians made use of this also, because they had a great advantage. They can lord it over the lowest caste. They can. I'm saying that they have that possibility. They also have got the acceptance of the higher caste. So in between, these three groups up to then, who were suffering from lack of possibilities of making themselves rich and all that. Though they had some ways of, they were not as poor as the lowest caste, but they found a possibility of going up. So they are the people who went into commercial cultivation in a large scale. And some of them made enough money, more than that of the Brahmins and the Nayars and the top people, castes. Even the Rajas. There were Christians and Muslims giving loans to the Maharajas, because Maharajas were finding it difficult to meet their expenses. So they will turn to these people. So I'll tell you a story. In fact, the story I'm going to tell you is about a Iyava gentleman who belonged to a family which used to give the highest land tax to the Maharaja of Travancore. But he is an Iyava. Iyava meaning he is below the Nayars. They are not allowed to enter the temple. So they cannot even walk in front of the temple. They have to take a Aita Vadi, like behind the temple they've got a route through which. So this gentleman, in 1911, for the first time in Travancore, the southernmost state, bought a motor car for himself. Otherwise, motor cars were reserved for the Maharajas and Tourage and British officers and all that. So he bought a car. He could afford it. He had a 3-storied building and all that. But whenever he wants to go to the capital, that's the city of Trivandrum, he has to drive in front of the very famous temple called Bavelikara Sri Krishna Kshetra. But he cannot do that. A furlong away, he has to stop his car and go walk through the Aitavadi, through the back road. But he had a chauffeur, he had a driver who is from a very poor family. That's why he is working for him as a driver. But the driver belongs to the higher caste of Naya. So he can drive with all glory and then let his master get into the car. In fact, he himself told this story to Sri Narayana Guru, the doyen, the best known social reformer that Kerala has ever seen. He told him that, So people were, many people like that, belonging to that kind of middle level or lower middle level, were dying to get opportunities to come up economically. Yeah, now what I'm trying to say is that these 3 groups, they jumped at this opportunity and they made money. They made money. I'm not saying that everybody, but large number of them made money. And they were richer than the upper caste, the so-called uppermost caste. So the social ordering which were there got completely changed. And that ordering, the change of that order was channeled by a set of movements called socio-religious reform movements. Sri Narayana Guru was the best known among them. There were also other leaders from different communities, even among the lowest caste, who didn't benefit from this kind of development. But that we'll come to later. But I'm saying that each of the community and caste, including the Christians, Muslims, Iravas, everywhere, everybody had, say, between 1860 to 1950, they had their own socio-religious reform movement, and they changed some of their earlier practices and came up with new ways of facing the world. So it completely changed Kerala, and that is now, some people call it the Renaissance. Whether that word can be used or not, I've got my doubts, but nevertheless, some tremendous change had occurred in Kerala. Kerala may not have had a social revolution, as initially we talked about a social revolution. There was no social revolution, but this was almost like a social revolution in the sense that the whole arrangements have come under a different proposition. Now, with this kind of changes, the leadership of this movement, which was initially with the social-religious reform movements, but eventually it gets diverted to the political movements. The nationalist movement, that's the Indian National Congress and other state congress and all that, the communist movement or communist socialist movement, etc., all kinds of. And how do they come to power? Because in the 1930s, there was this world economic depression. There was a great depression in the world economy. And that depression, agriculture products in particular, lost in value, in their money that they can fetch in the market. In that kind of a crisis situation, people realized, until then, they were organizing under different communities, different castes and different caste leaders and community leaders. But they found that I may be a Christian, but I've got my friend may be a rich Christian, but I am a poor Christian. So poor Christian's interest and the rich Christian's interest need not tally. Similarly, a poor Innova finds his or her interests do not tally with the interests of the rich Innova. So there is an economic cleavage between the groups. And this cleavage is the gap into which the particularly political movements in general, but particularly the left-oriented parties came into leadership, and they became the leadership. Came into leadership. By this time, the general public in the state developed three major demands. One was that they wanted a united Kerala to be formed. At that time, there was the Malabar district, which was ruled by the British. There was the Cochin state, ruled by a Maharaja of Cochin. And there was the state of Travancore, ruled by the Maharaja of Travancore. So they wanted all three to be combined together. Malayali, Malayalam is the language, so they called themselves Malayalis. And they wanted a Malayali unit, Aikya Kerala. They wanted an Aikya Kerala. And this Aikya Kerala demand was not a caste-based demand, it was not a class-based demand either. It was a people's demand. Second was that they wanted basic land reforms, because they realized that it is through owning land that even the middle class could come up. Whatever little land they had, they can use it for further use. But those without land, what happens to them? They got completely sidetracked. So there were, now we are trying to compute what percentage. It should be something around 10 to 11% of the population who were considered to be the poorest, the lowest caste and all that. They didn't have, very few of them might have had a little bit of land, but normally they don't have anything to bank upon. They also had their religious reform movement. They had great leaders like Sri Ayyankali, Sri Poikai Johanan. These are people who were remarkable leaders. But even with such leadership, they could not make any gains because they were not given any land. So they were left out. But the others, the middle caste, gained. Now, when people like Ken Raj, Amartya Sen and others study, they are impressed by the distribution that has gone on. But distribution up to or a certain level, not to the lowest level. Now, the left movement tried to project that. And that is how they came to power in 1957. They came to power in the first election to the United Kerala. But then soon the others who were against the communists and all that, they got themselves organized. They got the government dismissed from power, even though they had a majority. Once they were dismissed from power, they were not allowed to come into power for 10 years. It's a long period in any politics, being away from... then the communists had also to compromise. They went in for a rainbow coalition. They went in for coalition with parties which were apparently against their own interests, but nevertheless they wanted them also to be part of a coalition. That is how they came back into political power. By the time the initial strength of the movement for Aikya Kerala, which of course was realized, but land reforms. And the third demand was that people realized land is one thing, but why do you want land? Once you have land, you can use it to get your children educated in modern schools. And modern schools and education became a primary factor. Therefore, the third demand was in democratizing education. So these three demands became the demands of the almost all groups in Kerala, and the left benefited from it initially, but then they were ousted from power. I will stop here, and in fact, I was when I started speaking, I didn't account for your translation. Otherwise, I would. But the ways in which the left government initially thought of handling this issue was through two major means. One was, of course, decentralizing power. The other was through cooperativization. And I had some points prepared for that I would reserve for the time.